It's Deena Thomson, author of Fallen Poppies, and this is Chapter 46.
Chapter 46. Alan Michael sat slumped in Mara Joy's living room chair, sipping his rye and ginger ale. The ice made clinking sounds in his glass as he swirled it in his hands. He was feeling warm and fuzzy from the alcohol, and his eyes began to droop. "Wakey, wakey, Mikey!" Mara Joy's shrill voice startled him out of his coma. "Christ, do you have to be so loud?" he asked, raising his glass to his forehead. It felt cool on his damp brow. She smirked and sat down on the sofa, lounging back and lighting a cigarette. A black silk robe with oriental geisha girls dancing around the hem clung to her figure perfectly, tracing the small bulge beginning to emerge from her midsection. Alan Michael's eyes darted away from her protruding stomach, his jaw tightening as he attempted to conceal the revulsion emanating from within him. He didn't share the rest of his family's elation over Mara Joy's condition. In fact, the very thought of her with child nauseated him. "Now, brother, is that the way you talk to a pregnant woman?" Mara Joy teased, tossing her high-heeled slippers off her feet and onto the floor. "Must you always talk about that?" His voice was tight with anger, and the disdain in his eyes could not be disguised. "No, if it bothers you, we can talk about something else. What would you like to talk about, Mikey? School?" she said sarcastically. "Girls?" He glared at her. "Stop it," he said, downing the rest of his drink and standing to make himself a fresh glass. He didn't like it when Mara Joy teased him, especially after just having a terrible evening. Alan Michael had been out on a date with a young girl who slightly resembled Mara Joy. Slightly, meaning that she had dark hair. That is where the similarities ended. He wined and dined the young woman, and she was charmed by his good looks and manners. That was until it was time to take her home. He'd stopped at a makeout location and proceeded with the usual kissing and petting that went with a good date. But then he became increasingly forceful and demanding, nearly raping the poor young girl, who fled from the car, crying. Alan Michael, driving slowly beside the frightened girl as she walked, tried to persuade her to get back into the car. She refused, claiming he was sick, and she never wanted to see him again. Despite Alan Michael's knowledge, she had every reason to fear him. He had pinned the girl down against the car seat, his hands clamped tightly around her wrists as he loomed over her. She withered beneath him and let out a stifled sob. His face was a mask of terror and rage, shouting Mara Joy's name. "I did it! I killed her!" The girl's heart pounded in her chest as she pulled on the car door handle. She stumbled out of the vehicle and fell to her knees before scrambling back up and sprinting away from him. His eyes had been what scared her the most. They were bloodshot and dilated, making her feel like she was staring into a black void. She knew she had to get away from him, that at any moment he might snap and drag her back into the darkness of his mind. They were the eyes of a madman, and at that moment she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone. If she ever hoped to live, she had to run for her life. She told him as much while he followed her in his car. Angry and humiliated, not understanding the bitch's attitude, he came to the one place he always felt drawn to, Mara Joy's. Not surprised to see him, she filled him with booze as she played records from her favorite singer, Al Jolson. "Toot toot tootsie goodbye," Mara Joy sang along, wiggling her toes. Alan Michael rubbed his temples, his headache pounding behind his eyes. He gulped down his drink and refreshed it once more. "Please, do we have to listen to that music?" he whined, sitting back down in his chair with a thud. Mara Joy's eyes sparkled. "As I recall, it was you who showed up at my doorstep." Her words were playful, almost teasing. "Ha ha, very funny." He melted back into the chair and slurped his drink. The strong, bitter taste burnt his throat, and he felt himself relaxing. "Ma got a letter the other day from Pauline," Mara Joy said, sitting up. It had been 2 months since Pauline left for Africa. "I know," Alan Michaels said dully. "Can you believe it? Our Pauline off in Africa living with a bunch of barbarians." Mara Joy grinned with satisfaction as she lifted her cigarette to her lips, the orange tip glowing. She inhaled deeply and exhaled a long stream of smoke with pleasure. "They are called pygmies, and they are not barbarians. They are hunters and gatherers, or so Pauline writes," Alan Michaels said, bored, his fingers massaging his temples. "Well, whatever they are, it is very interesting. Pauline seems to have found a good calling in life," Mara Joy said, smiling to herself. "I can't help but feel responsible for helping her life change." "For crying out loud, Mara Joy. You sent her to school and she took off with the first weirdos she met, leaving you high and dry to explain it all to Ma and Pa." His voice was thick with jealousy. What was wrong with her? Since when had she taken such an interest in that idiot's life? Pauline had always been an imbecile, and Mara Joy had once thought so too. "You are just being a jealous green-eyed monster, and I won't let you ruin my good mood." She swung her feet onto the ground. "Jealous of what? Of being an idiot?" He sat up. "Yes." She stood up, touching the butt of her tummy affectionately. "That idiot is doing more with her life than any of us." "You have got to be kidding," he snapped, draining his drink in one long gulp, the ice cubes clinking against each other as they hit the bottom of the glass. His vision was beginning to blur, and his head felt fuzzy. "Stop! I am tired of hearing your resentful words," Mara Joy said, raising her hand. "Fine. Since you are so fond of what our sisters are up to these days, I thought you would like to hear the latest news on your favorite one." He smirked, sensing he had Mara Joy's attention. "What favorite sister?" Her voice strained. She settled back on the couch, lying down, suddenly exhausted with her brother. "Oh, you know the one." He walked over to Mara Joy, sat down beside her, placing a cold hand down on her firm, round belly. Mara Joy tensed and let out a gasp. Her hands went protectively over Alan Michaels' stronghold. "Remember the sister?" He slowly rotated his hand around her stomach, his voice icy cold. Mara Joy became rigid. "Stop, Alan Michael," she said through clenched teeth. "You know the sister I'm talking about. The sister who stole your husband right from under your nose." "Stop it! I mean it," she said, trying to pry his hands from her tummy. He held on firmly, her attempts futile. "The sister who bore your husband's bastard children when you couldn't even carry one to term." Alan Michael was dazed, his eyes glassy. A humming had begun deep inside his ear, and he could hear nothing over the sound of it. "Seems our fertile sister is full of baby again," he continued. Mara Joy's head shot up, surprised. Heat raced to her face. "I wonder whose baby it is," he continued. "Maybe she is preparing to give Larry a son in case something should happen again to yours. Joanna is always ready to supply your husbands with the children you can't have." Mara Joy struck Alan Michael forcefully across the face. His head flew sideways easily in his muddled state. A red handprint began to surface on his pale skin. He raised his hand off of her stomach and placed it on his hot cheek. "How dare you!" Mara Joy said, scrambling up and advancing on him like a madwoman. He sat, unmoving, clutching his stinging face. "How dare you spew that filth in my house? You have some nerve." "What hurts you more?" he asked, picking up his drink, rolling his glass casually in his free hand. "The thought that Joanna is once again pregnant with your husband's bastard, or that she might have another child where you will be left with none. Again." "Get out," Mara Joy said, protectively draping a hand across her belly. "Get out of here and never come back. You are no longer welcome in my home, you little shit." Startled, he looked numbly at her. He had intended to get her riled up, not to get himself thrown out, exiled from her presence. He had only wanted to get her blood boiling about Joanna. "Come on, Mara Joy, you don't mean it." He tilted his glass to his lips. She grabbed it from his hands, banging his teeth in the process. Her eyes were wild with rage, and her hands shook as she clenched them into fists at her side. She pointed a finger at him and stepped closer, her voice rising with each word. "I do mean it," she snarled. "You don't make fun at the expense of my baby. You don't come into my home and say Joanna will bear another child and mine will never be born. Do you hear me?" "Mara Joy, I was just kidding. You know, like we always do," he said, becoming frightened. He hadn't seen her this angry since Joanna had run off with Chad. He realized he had gone too far. He stood up and went to her, trying to comfort her by placing his arms around her shoulders. It didn't work. Mara Joy turned on him, striking Alan Michael forcefully around the head. "Get out of here before I call the police. Do you understand? I never want to see your pitiful face here again." She whirled on him, once more hitting him around the ears. Alan Michael lamely tried to shield himself with his hands, too stunned to do anything more. "You are so pathetic, Alan Michael, with the way you moon around me," she spat, face crimson with fury. "What are you thinking in that sick mind of yours, huh? Do you actually think I don't know how you feel about me?" His eyes widened as he took an involuntary step back, his face flushing furiously with embarrassment. Was he that obvious? Was his desire for his sister so transparent that everyone could see? The thought mortified him. What if everyone knew? What would they think? What kind of pervert thirsted for his own sister? He shook his head. No, she wasn't really his sister. Not really. "I don't know what you mean," he said, playing dumb in his drunken stupor. Mara Joy tilted her head back, a cackling, evil laugh exploding from the back of her throat. "You poor fool! Do you really think I don't know how you lust after me? How you desire your own sister?" "Don't be ridiculous," Alan Michael said with little conviction. "Ridiculous?" She shoved her fevered face into Alan Michael's pale one. "Ridiculous is you thinking it could possibly happen. That is what is ridiculous." He could take no more. Humiliated, he pushed Mara Joy out of his way, fleeing the house and his sister's voice reverberating in his ears. He ran until his lungs felt like they would burst. Stopping, he crouched forward, his hands on his thighs, panting and spitting saliva that formed in his mouth. He stayed in the same position for some time until, finally, he could catch his breath. When he felt he had some control, he straightened his spine and breathed deeply in the cool night air. His thoughts were dark and hateful. How could this be happening to him? He had lost Mara Joy forever. She had ridiculed him worse than an animal. Why? Why had she turned on him? It was plain for him to see, so obvious in his twisted mind. It wasn't him and the things he had said. They had always been close, and would have always been that way if it hadn't been for her. Alan Michael let out a deep belly yell that echoed throughout the neighborhood. Dogs began to bark, and someone yelled out the window for him to leave, or they were going to call the cops. He began to walk, his feet moving faster and faster, his brain pulsing with hate. The more he thought of it, the more it seemed to make sense. He lost the only person that mattered to him, and it was all Joanna's fault. Joanna didn't hear Alan Michael creep through the front door of her cottage. How could she? She was sound asleep in bed with Chad. They slumbered peacefully, unaware of the uninvited guest sneaking up their staircase to their bedroom. Alan Michael stopped in front of Joanna's daughter's room. Jenna slept peacefully with a doll snugly tucked under her chin. "She should have been Marjoy's daughter," he screamed in his head. Then he slowly crept to the boys' room. Charles slept with his bottom up in the air, his legs scrunched beneath his tummy. "How sweet," Alan Michael said sarcastically under his breath. He shut the door and walked quietly to Joanna and Chad's room. There she lay, the destroyer of his life. Rage surged through his body like never before. His mind could see nothing but hate, blinding him to everything else around him but her. The tramp, the trollop, whore, look at her. The words screamed in his head. Look at her lying with another woman's husband, Jezebel. The malice Alan Michael felt for Joanna was overpowering. It consumed his mind. His hands shook with rage as he looked at her lying in bed, unaware of the storm of emotions around her. Everything in his life that had gone wrong was associated with that woman who lay in that bed, oblivious to it all. The cloying scent of hatred filled the air, its tentacles wrapped around his throat and squeezing the life out of him. Everything felt like it was on fire, a raging inferno of pain and suffering that could be traced back to one source: Joanna. He didn't even think twice when he raised the butcher knife above his slumbering sister, and he didn't stop plunging the knife into her soft, white flesh, even when she screamed out in terror. He kept on thrusting his dagger into her body repeatedly, blanking out the sounds of her screams and those of her husband. Nothing would stop him from finishing what he had started. Nothing. A sharp object struck his head forcefully from behind, and everything red went black.